She had expected him to fight. That was the thing he understood most clearly in the hours after her text. She had delivered that message with a built-in assumption that he would call, or plead, or flood her with questions that she could answer or deflect on her own terms and timeline. The break only works as a strategy when the other person agrees to remain in the suspended animation it requires, still emotionally available, still waiting, still invested enough to ask what it means. She had not anticipated stillness, and so when she received his two-word reply and nothing more, she called him childish, because his silence was exactly why she needed space. He noticed the reversal immediately. She had made a unilateral decision without conversation, delivered by text, had briefed her family before informing him, and now she was framing his measured non-reaction as the communication failure. He didn't point that out. He ordered another bourbon, opened Facebook, and changed his status to single. By morning, she was already rewriting the story for everyone else.
It was a Tuesday evening in late September when everything changed, though on the surface it looked like almost nothing at all. He was sitting at the hotel bar in Chicago, nursing a bourbon after a long and draining day of industry presentations, the kind of day that leaves you physically present but mentally somewhere else, half watching the bartender polish glasses while the hum of the city floated in from outside. He was 28, confident in his life, certain about his relationship, and genuinely looking forward to getting back to New York and back to Natalie, the woman he'd been with for 4 years, the woman he'd talked about marriage and children with, the woman he thought was as invested in their future as he was. His phone lit up with her name, and he reached for it with the ease of someone who expects nothing unusual, just a goodnight message or a question about when his flight landed. Instead, what he read stopped him cold. She had written that she had been thinking, that she had already told her parents and her sister Vanessa that they were taking a break, just for a little while, and that she needed some space to figure things out. That was it. No phone call, no conversation, no warning. Just a unilateral announcement delivered via text message while he sat 800 miles away in a bar he didn't want to be in. He stared at that message for a full 5 minutes, reading it over and over, not because it was complicated, but because his brain refused to process how casually she had dismantled 4 years with a single paragraph. What struck him most wasn't even the content. It was that she had already told other people before telling him, which meant this wasn't a spontaneous feeling, but a decision that had been building, shared with family, planned, and only now delivered to the one person who deserved to hear it first. He didn't panic. He didn't type out a long emotional response or call her immediately demanding answers. He thought about what she had written, about what it truly meant, and then he typed back 2 words with calm, deliberate precision. "Thanks for letting me know." 4 years, and that was all he gave her. Not because he was heartless, but because he understood in that moment with absolute clarity that a person who breaks up with you by text while you're across the country, who has already briefed her family before informing you, has already shown you exactly who they are and how much you mean to them. When she responded almost immediately, asking if that was really all he had to say, he said nothing more. And when she called him childish for not engaging, he didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't chase the explanation she suddenly seemed eager to have after she had already made every decision without him. Instead, he put down his phone, finished his bourbon, and began the quiet process of letting go. He hadn't always been the kind of person who could receive a message like that and respond with 2 words and a bourbon. That composure had been earned, slowly, over years of watching people and learning the difference between what they said and what they did. But before all of that, before Chicago and the text and the silence that followed, there had been 4 genuinely good years, or at least years he believed were good, which at the time amounted to the same thing. He had met Natalie through mutual friends at a rooftop bar in the city, one of those warm summer evenings where the skyline looks like something out of a movie, and everyone seems more interesting than they actually are in daylight. But Natalie had been genuinely interesting, sharp, funny, driven, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately understood the social architecture of it. They had hit it off instantly, the conversation flowing in that rare, effortless way that makes you feel like you've known someone longer than you have. Within 6 months, they were talking about the future in concrete terms: marriage, children, where they'd live, what kind of life they'd build together. It felt real and solid and earned. What he didn't fully reckon with in those early months was the weight of her family's expectations, which were never spoken aloud but were always present, like a pressure system in the room. Natalie came from money, the kind of old, comfortable, quietly superior money that doesn't announce itself, but makes itself known in every small detail, in the Hampton vacations and the summer house that was more beautiful than most people's permanent homes, in the way her mother, Patricia, assessed people with a warmth that was also somehow a verdict. Her father was the same. They had liked him well enough, or had seemed to, but there were moments, a comment here, a comparison there, where he sensed that well enough was the ceiling, that he occupied a category called acceptable but not exceptional in their private rankings. He had brushed those moments aside because Natalie had seemed unbothered by them, and because the relationship itself was good, warm, and full of genuine affection. They traveled together, built routines, fought occasionally and resolved it, grew into each other's lives the way long-term couples do, organically and without ceremony. He had turned down opportunities, adjusted plans, and anchored his future to hers without resentment because he believed she was doing the same. The Seattle job offer had come 8 months before Chicago, a significant step up in title and salary, a genuine career leap, and he had turned it down because Natalie didn't want to leave New York. Her family was there, her job was there, her entire world was there, and he had understood that, respected it, and folded his own ambitions around hers. That's what you do when you're building something with someone. That's what you do when you trust that the investment is mutual. He had no reason to believe otherwise, until a Tuesday night in late September in a hotel bar in Chicago, when a single text message quietly dismantled everything he thought he understood about the 4 years he had given her.
She had expected him to fight. That was the thing he understood most clearly in the hours after her text. She had delivered that message with a built-in assumption that he would call or plead or flood her with questions that she could answer or deflect on her own terms and timeline. The phrase, taking a break, only works as a strategy when the other person agrees to remain in the suspended animation it requires, still emotionally available, still waiting, still invested enough to ask what it means and what comes next. She had not anticipated stillness, and so when she received his 2-word reply and nothing more, her response had been almost immediate and deeply revealing. She had written back asking if that was really all she had to say, and when he confirmed it was, she had called him childish, said his silence was exactly why she needed space. He noticed the reversal immediately. She had made a unilateral decision without conversation, delivered it via text from 800 miles away, had already briefed her family before informing him, and now she was framing his measured non-reaction as the communication failure in the relationship. He didn't point that out. He didn't type it, didn't call her to explain it, didn't spend the rest of the night composing the message he wished he could send. He ordered another bourbon, and then he opened Facebook. What he did next was small in the mechanical sense. A few taps, a status change from in a relationship with Natalie Chun to single, but it was enormous in what it represented. It wasn't done to humiliate her or to make a public declaration. He didn't write a post, didn't caption anything, didn't tag anyone. He simply updated the factual record of his life to reflect what she had just told him was true. If they were on a break, they were not together. If they were not together, he was single. The logic was clean, and he followed it without drama. He went to bed. By morning, he had 47 notifications. What he discovered when he scrolled through them was illuminating in the worst possible way. Natalie had apparently been awake through the night, not reflecting or grieving, but managing the narrative. She had told people they were working through things, that it was a temporary rough patch, that he was struggling with it. Her friends had responded with sympathy directed entirely at her. Her mother had commented with encouragement. The story she was telling publicly bore no resemblance to what had actually happened, which was that she had sent a text to her boyfriend of 4 years while he sat in a hotel bar in another city and told him, through a premeditated message, that she had already reclassified their relationship to her family. He had not struggled with anything.
He had simply declined to perform the grief she had scripted for him. He sat in his hotel room reading through those notifications and felt the last traces of confusion leaving him. This wasn't a woman who had sent a clumsy text in a moment of panic. This was someone who had planned the exit, staged the narrative, and was disappointed that he hadn't played his assigned role in it. That clarity, cold and clean as the Chicago morning outside his window, made everything that came next easier. He might have been able to construct a version of events where Natalie was simply confused, where the break was genuinely about some internal uncertainty that had nothing to do with anyone else, where the most charitable interpretation was also the true one. He had not been looking for confirmation of what he already suspected. But the truth has a way of surfacing regardless, and it arrived through Maya, Natalie's best friend since college, a woman he had always liked for her directness and who, apparently, had a threshold for guilt that Natalie had underestimated. Maya reached out about a week after the text, in a message that opened with an apology before it opened with anything else, which told him everything he needed to know about what was coming. She told him she felt terrible about what had happened, and that she thought he deserved to know the full picture. And so she told him. There was a man named Trevor, an investment banker, Manhattan corner office, Porsche in the garage, the full aspirational profile. Trevor went to the same gym as Natalie and had been talking to her for approximately 6 weeks before she sent that text from Chicago. 6 weeks of conversations, which meant that while he and Natalie had been FaceTiming at night, while she had asked about his conference and told him about brunch with her sister and said she missed him, she had simultaneously been cultivating something with someone else, testing its weight and temperature, auditioning it quietly against what she already had. The break wasn't a revelation she'd arrived at alone. It was a logistical step, a way to officially create distance from him while she determined whether Trevor was worth the trade. She hadn't ended things. She had simply reclassified him from partner to backup, placed him in a holding pattern of her own design, and expected him to hover there patiently while she made up her mind. Maya said Natalie had genuinely convinced herself this was fair, that because nothing physical had happened yet, she wasn't technically doing anything wrong, that taking a break was an honest thing to call it, that she was simply being careful before making a major decision. But what she had actually done, as he sat hearing all of this, was treat 4 years of his life as a hedge against uncertainty. He was the safe, known quantity. Trevor was the exciting unknown. And rather than end one before exploring the other, she had tried to hold both positions simultaneously. He thanked Maya for telling him. He wasn't angry at Maya. She had been caught between loyalty and conscience, and had chosen conscience. He appreciated that more than he could easily say. What he felt, processing everything she'd shared, wasn't the explosive rage he might have expected. It was something quieter and more permanent, a complete, total removal of doubt. Every instinct he had trusted in that hotel bar, the instinct that told him not to beg, not to ask why, not to negotiate with the terms she'd laid out, had been correct. He had not overreacted. He had, if anything, underreacted. Though the more he thought about it, the more he understood that his calm hadn't been a failure of feeling. It had been the only appropriate response to someone who had already made their decision long before they bothered to tell him. There is a particular kind of freedom that arrives not with celebration but with quiet resolution, the kind that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but simply settles into you like a decision that was always waiting to be made. He felt it on that Saturday morning when he opened his laptop, found the email thread with the Seattle offer, and typed a reply accepting it. The position had been on the table for months, better title, better salary, a genuine step forward in every professional metric that mattered. He had turned it down for Natalie. Not because she had demanded he turn it down, not because she had threatened or manipulated him into it, but because he had loved her and she hadn't wanted to leave New York. And when you're building a life with someone, you make accommodations. That's not weakness, that's partnership. But the accommodation had cost him something real, and now the reason for it had been dissolved by a text message, and the math had changed entirely. He called the hiring manager on Saturday morning and told him he was in. They wanted him to start in 6 weeks. He said that worked perfectly. When he hung up the phone, he sat for a moment in the particular silence of a decision that has just become irreversible, and what he felt was not grief or relief or triumph. It was simply rightness, the sensation of moving in the direction he should have been moving all along. He had given New York to Natalie, and she had given him back nothing but a Tuesday text. Seattle, which had once felt like the sacrifice he'd chosen not to make, now felt like the gift she had inadvertently handed him by showing him who she was before he gave the city anything more. He spent the rest of that Saturday doing what he had already started before Natalie's text had arrived: packing, cleaning, getting his apartment in order. His lease was month to month, which meant he could be gone in weeks if he chose, and he chose. There was something deeply satisfying about that process, about the physical act of dismantling one life in preparation for another, not with bitterness but with intention. He packed carefully, kept what mattered, let go of what didn't. He made a list of things to do before the move: notify his landlord, wrap up his current job professionally, find an apartment in Seattle, tell the people who deserved to hear it from him directly. He was methodical about it in the way you can only be when you're genuinely at peace with a direction. He didn't post about it, didn't make announcements, didn't curate a social media version of his reinvention. He simply began. What had looked like loss, the relationship, the future he'd planned, the version of himself that had stayed in New York for someone who was already looking elsewhere, had quietly rearranged itself into something that looked, with every passing hour, less like an ending and more like a correction. The Seattle job was real, the salary increase was real, the city was real, and for the first time in months, possibly the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, the future felt entirely and unapologetically his own.
He had not expected her to come. He had updated his Facebook status, accepted the Seattle offer, and begun the practical work of leaving, and he had assumed that the silence he'd maintained since Chicago would communicate clearly enough that there was nothing left to negotiate. But Natalie had never been comfortable with silence. She interpreted it as an invitation to fill, and so she showed up at his apartment on the Saturday after he returned from the conference, unannounced, around 2 in the afternoon, knocking on his door with the vaguely surprised expression of someone who hadn't fully expected him to answer. He opened the door. He didn't move from the doorway. She asked if they could talk, and he said sure, and she asked if she could come in, and he stepped aside. She walked into the living room and stopped. The boxes were everywhere, not chaotic, not dramatic, just the organized evidence of a man who had already decided. She asked what it was all about, and he told her plainly. He was moving. He had accepted a job offer in Seattle, better opportunity, fresh start. He watched the color leave her face. She wanted to know when he had planned to tell her, and he said the thing that was simply, cleanly true. Why would he tell her? They were on a break. She was figuring things out. His life decisions were no longer her information. She stumbled over her words then, starting sentences she couldn't finish, cycling through several versions of the objection before settling on the one she must have believed would land hardest, that this was typical of him, that he always shut down instead of communicating. He laughed. Not cruelly, but genuinely, because the accusation was so perfectly inverted that it struck him as almost impressive. He reminded her, calmly, that she had sent him a text message while he was in another city, that she had not called, not asked to talk, not initiated any conversation. She had made an announcement. She said again that she had meant a break, not a breakup, and he said he understood the distinction she was drawing and that it didn't matter. On a break meant not together. Not together meant he owed her nothing. Then she cried. Real tears, he could tell the difference. She said she had made a mistake, that she had been confused, and then she started to say a name, Trevor, and caught herself, but not quickly enough. He hadn't brought up Trevor. He hadn't known she would confirm it herself, but she had, and the question was already out before she could walk it back. He asked who Trevor was, and she said nobody, just someone from the gym, just talking, nothing happened. He told her he hadn't asked if something happened. She had volunteered the name, which told its own story. She wiped her eyes and said she had realized she wanted to be with him, that Trevor was nothing, that she'd been stupid. He believed she believed that, but he also knew the difference between someone who had made a mistake and someone who had constructed a safety net, and he knew which one he was standing in front of. He told her as much, quietly, without cruelty, with the finality of someone who had already done all his grieving on a bar stool in Chicago.
2 weeks after Natalie left his apartment, a text arrived from a different direction entirely, from Vanessa, Natalie's younger sister, with who he had always had a genuinely warm and independent connection. Vanessa was getting married in early November at an upscale venue in Westchester, and he had originally been on the guest list as Natalie's +1, which, under the circumstances, he had simply assumed was no longer the case. But Vanessa was reaching out to tell him that he was still welcome, that he had always been more than just her sister's boyfriend to their family, and that she wanted him to know the invitation stood if he chose to use it. He appreciated the gesture more than he let on. There was something meaningful in being seen as a person distinct from the relationship, in being told that the friendship he had built with people over 4 years had its own value, separate from Natalie's choices. He wrote back that he didn't think it would be appropriate given everything, and Vanessa responded with the information she had perhaps not fully considered the effect of. Natalie was doing fine, had been miserable but was doing better, and, almost as an aside, was planning to bring Trevor to the wedding. He read that last part twice, not because it hurt in the way it once might have, he was past the point where that news could destabilize him, but because it confirmed, with the finality of a door clicking shut, every conclusion he had already drawn. The break had never been about space or confusion or self-discovery. It had been about auditions, and now the audition had produced a date to his ex-girlfriend's sister's wedding. He sat with that for a moment. Then something shifted in him, something small and not entirely noble, something he would later acknowledge freely without excessive apology. He texted Vanessa back and told her that actually he'd love to come. He confirmed his attendance, kept the message warm and simple, and offered nothing further. He didn't mention Seattle. He didn't mention that he was days away from signing a lease on a Capitol Hill apartment and weeks away from starting a job that paid 35% more than his current one. He didn't mention that the Facebook profile he was about to update would tell a story about his life that Natalie's version of events had conspicuously left out. He just said yes and thanked her. Was it petty? He thought about that question honestly and decided the answer was probably yes, at least in part. But he also thought about 4 years of his life, about the job he had turned down, about the text message in Chicago, about the boxes in his living room that she had been surprised by, about the voicemail from Trevor that she had never mentioned, and the 6 weeks of conversations she had conducted while telling him she missed him. He thought about being kept as a backup option, as a hedge against an unknown outcome. And he thought that, occasionally, when someone has used your patience as a strategy, the most honest response is to simply show up. The venue was exactly what he had expected. Circular driveway, valet parking, the kind of carefully maintained grandeur that announces itself without shouting. White-jacketed waitstaff moving through the cocktail hour with the precision of people who have done this 1,000 times. He had driven up from the city that morning, checked into a nearby hotel, and taken his time getting ready with the calm attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and no anxiety about where he was going. He wore his best suit, dark navy, well-fitted, the one that had earned him compliments in professional settings, and arrived at the cocktail hour with the easy confidence of a man who had been invited, who belonged, and who had nothing to prove to anyone in the room except possibly himself. Vanessa spotted him almost immediately and crossed the room with genuine happiness on her face, pulling him into a tight hug and whispering her thanks for coming. She looked beautiful, radiant in the particular way that brides are when everything they've imagined is finally visibly real. He told her so and meant it. Her husband was friendly and warm, the kind of person who asks good questions and actually listens to the answers. And when he heard about the Seattle move, he lit up. He had gone to college there, loved the city, had opinions about neighborhoods and restaurants that he shared with the enthusiasm of someone revisiting a happy chapter. It was a good conversation. Easy and genuine, the kind that reminds you that most people at most events are simply trying to connect with someone. And then he saw her. Natalie was across the room in a burgundy dress, her hair arranged in something elaborate and deliberate, and she was standing close to a tall man in a very expensive suit whose hand was resting on the small of her back while she laughed at something he was saying. Trevor, presumably, was everything the description had implied. Polished, confident, physically commanding in the way of men who have always been rewarded for their presence. He watched for a moment, not with jealousy, but with the detached curiosity of someone observing a scene they are no longer part of. Then Natalie's eyes found his across the room, and the laughter stopped as if a switch had been thrown. He raised his glass toward her slightly, not smugly, not triumphantly, just a small acknowledgement. the universal signal of two adults who share history and have agreed wordlessly to be civilized about it. She excused herself from Trevor and walked over, and he noted that she looked, objectively, extraordinary, which he registered without being moved by it, the way you might appreciate a painting in a gallery you're only passing through. She asked what he was doing there. He told her Vanessa had invited him, and he'd always liked her and hadn't wanted to miss her wedding day. She pointed out he hadn't told her he was coming. He agreed that was true and noted that he didn't have any obligation to. When Trevor drifted over to investigate the tension, they shook hands with perfect politeness. Trevor had clearly been given a version of events that omitted most of the relevant details, which was its own kind of answer to questions he hadn't asked.
The wedding reception was, in almost every respect, a genuinely good evening. He had been seated far from Natalie's table, close enough to the action that he wasn't invisible, far enough that no one could accuse him of staging a confrontation, and the people at his table turned out to be exactly the kind of company he needed. Vanessa's college friends, funny and unpretentious, people with no investment in the drama unfolding elsewhere in the room. They talked about Seattle, about mutual friends, about the city's coffee culture and its rain and its particular brand of ambitious Pacific Northwest energy. Several of them had connections there and offered restaurant recommendations with the generosity of people who are genuinely excited for someone's fresh chapter. He laughed more that evening than he had in months, and there was something quietly meaningful about that, about the discovery that his capacity for enjoyment had not been depleted, that it had simply been waiting for the right company. It was toward the end of the reception, when the event was beginning its gentle wind-down, that Natalie's mother Patricia found him. She had always been one of the warmer presences in Natalie's family, a woman of genuine intelligence and social grace who had told him more than once, in the private moments that arise at family gatherings, that she thought he was good for her daughter. She came to say goodbye and mentioned she had seen on Facebook that he was moving to Seattle, that it seemed like quite a change. He told her honestly that he was excited about it, that it felt like a fresh start. And then she said it. Natalie had mentioned just last week that they were working things out, that they'd had a long conversation and were figuring out how to move forward together. He felt the room shift slightly. He held her gaze. He told her as gently and as directly as he knew how that it wasn't true, that they had not spoken in over 3 weeks, that he had been single since the text message in September, that there had been no conversation about moving forward. He watched Patricia's expression move through several registers. Confusion first, then something careful and measured, then the particular disappointment of a mother who understands that her child has not been honest. She said she hoped Seattle would treat him well, that he deserved to be happy, and she said it with the weight of someone correcting an old judgment. Then she walked away, and he watched her cross the room and find Natalie near the bar, and what happened next he could only observe from a distance. Natalie's head shaking, her hands gesturing in the way they did when she was defending herself, and then the moment she looked over at him with pure, undiluted anger. He had not set out to expose her. He had simply answered an honest question with an honest answer, which is all he had ever done. If her own lies had found her at her sister's wedding in front of her mother at the worst possible moment, that was not a trap he had set. That was a consequence she had been carrying since September, and it had finally, quietly caught up with her. He is writing this from his apartment in Capitol Hill, Seattle, 6 weeks after the wedding, with the rain doing what Seattle rain does. Not dramatic, not oppressive, just persistently present, a background texture to a city that has suited him better than he expected and faster than he deserved. The apartment is good. The job is better. The life taking shape around him feels, in ways he finds genuinely difficult to articulate, more authentically his own than anything he had been living in New York for the last year or two. Natalie called 3 times the night of the wedding. He didn't answer. She left voicemails that traveled through the full emotional spectrum, angry first, then desperate, then something quieter and more resigned. And the next morning he sent her a single text that said he hadn't humiliated her, that her lies had simply caught up with her, that he hoped she and Trevor were happy, and that he was asking her not to contact him again. She didn't listen, not at first. For 2 weeks texts arrived sporadically, defensive, then apologetic, then a version of the story where Trevor had meant nothing and she had realized her terrible mistake. He read them and didn't respond to any of them.
Maya reached out eventually with the full accounting. After Patricia had confronted Natalie at the wedding, there had been a complete unraveling. Natalie had admitted to seeing Trevor, but maintained nothing physical had occurred until after the break began. And she had offered, as explanation for all of it, that she had panicked about commitment and worried that he wasn't ambitious enough to meet her family's expectations. That last part arrived with a small, clean sting, not because he believed it, but because it clarified the architecture of a relationship he had been misreading for longer than he'd admitted. He had been measuring himself against a standard that kept moving, held by a family whose approval was never guaranteed because it was never meant to be. Trevor, for his part, had apparently ended things after the wedding. He had put together enough of the story to understand he was either a rebound or a reason, and he wasn't interested in either role. Natalie was, according to Maya, now single and working on herself. He wished her well in that endeavor and meant it without reservation. Vanessa sent an apology for the tension, which he brushed aside. She had nothing to apologize for. Patricia sent a Facebook message saying she had always considered him family and was sorry for how things unfolded. He told her he held no grudges, and that was true. His new job is challenging in the ways that make you better, demanding and intellectually alive, the kind of work that makes Friday feel earned. He has made friends. He went on dates with someone he met at a coffee shop near his office, someone straightforward and easy to be around, someone who says what she means. He doesn't hate Natalie. He's not angry. He feels, if he is being fully honest with himself, a deep and uncomplicated gratitude. Gratitude that she showed him who she was before a marriage, before children, before the entanglements that make leaving genuinely hard. Sometimes the truth arrives as a gift wrapped in disappointment. Sometimes the text that ends everything is also the text that begins something better. He finished his bourbon in Chicago, changed a status, accepted a job, and built a life. That's the whole story.